Holy Week, the most sacred part of the whole Christian calendar. So it's a really, really big deal. And Palm Sunday is so interesting because Palm Sunday started out like we did, pretty high up. There's a parade. Jesus is coming into town. And Christians for centuries have been waving their palm branches and celebrating Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem. So it's a really big deal. You know, for the 3 years or so that Jesus did ministry, he was basically out in the hinterlands, you know, up north, Sea of Galilee, with those rural people. But here, as the Passover approaches, he's making a big pilgrimage into Jerusalem, the big city. And Jesus is a religious figure, and so when he's there, a lot of people would want to come into the temple. But Jesus in particular, as a religious leader, would want to go into the temple. And I would say the normal thing to do if you were a religious leader, you would come into the temple, or maybe if he was in the hinterlands in the synagogue, you'd interact with other religious leaders, and maybe it'd be kind of rare sometimes. You might be kind of isolated. You might want to talk to other religious leaders. And then a big tradition among the religious leaders or rabbis, that era, before that era, right up into our era now, would be dialogue, interacting with each other and learning. And some of that learning could seem a little intense, kind of like debate, and it could be a little sharp. And one thing to be aware of as readers of the New Testament, sometimes these dialogues that take place across the Gospels seem a little intense, and then we as modern Christian people and others before us can kind of project on to some of those dialogues between Jesus and other religious leaders. The other religious leaders are terrible and wrong and awful. And, more recent scholars say, you know what, it's normal for people to dialogue and debate. That is normative in that religious culture. And if you heard the phrase iron sharpens iron, that's how you grow and get better, is in dialogue and debate, and that's pretty normal. And a wonderful scholar named Amy Jill Levine has said, Christians, stop piling on to the Pharisees. In certain stories, we make them sound like these evil people. But a lot of the times, it's normal, healthy debate, learning more, and going back and forth. And that was normative. Just kind of learning from each other. That's a great thing. So that said, on Palm Sunday, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, what happens next? Well, things get a little spicy. And I love it in the Gospel of Matthew. As soon as Jesus comes into town, it's like verses 1 through 11, there in Matthew chapter 21. Verse 12, the very next verse, what does Jesus do? And we weren't quite there. We skipped ahead in our time for discovery. Jesus comes into the temple and he, Bible study people, what does he do? He upsets the tables in the temple, and he chases out the money changers and the people selling doves. So Jesus totally raises a ruckus. Should we do that some year on Palm Sunday? Do you want to do that? Hosanna, Hosanna, and then throw some tables over? Something to think about, maybe the next year. It's the very next verse. That's what Jesus does. So he goes into the temple, overturns the tables, and then the next morning he comes back to the temple again, and on his way there, he has a little incident that is Sue Barrett's favorite part of Holy Week. Do you know what I'm talking about, Sue Barrett? What does Jesus do on the way to the temple?
He does not like the fig tree.
Yes, he does not like a particular fig tree. And it's like, what? why is Jesus being mean to a tree? So it's very puzzling. So Jesus goes to the fig tree. He's maybe hungry. He's looking for figs. Are there figs? No figs. And so Jesus curses the fig tree and it withers. Oh, that'd be a fun story too. Yeah? And the tree withers away. And the disciples are like, man, whoa. So, kind of intense. And then something else, that happens there in the temple, right after the Palm Sunday, Hosanna, Hosanna. In Matthew's gospel, the religious authorities are like, oh, those kids, oh, those children are making me crazy with their Hosanna, Hosanna, woo, woo. And Jesus says, out of the mouths of babes comes praise. So Jesus is sticking it to people. It's pretty intense, a little spicy. So that's the backdrop when Jesus comes in, from his Airbnb in Bethany and interacts with people in the temple grounds. And he comes upon just gaggles of religious people. It mentions chief priests and scribes and Sadducees and Pharisees and other elders and people. So he has all these different interactions. So as you're reading Matthew chapter 21 and chapter 22, there are all these incidences. Across those two chapters, Jesus is in the temple, and more particularly, he's interacting with religious leaders. And then there's all these little teachings and interactions in that context. So, in that context, on the one hand, the religious leaders are really trying to poke at Jesus. And it seems like they're a little bit next level because they're first testing Jesus, but they're also trying to trip him up. So it's beyond the healthy, normative iron sharpening iron. It's dark. It's kind of mean. They're not really there to elucidate and learn more from somebody who's different, which would be the normal thing for teachers of that level. Let's learn some more. No, they're trying to expose him. They're trying to embarrass him. They're trying to find a flaw so they can say, aha! They're not moving toward healing and light. They're moving toward harm, using the ordinary vehicle of human conversation and dialogue. So there's all these questions they have for Jesus, trying to trip him up. But then look at those stories on your own. Jesus' responses are so incredible. So they'll set him up, they'll flatter him, they do all these different techniques, and then Jesus will answer back in a way they're like, oh, dang it, that was a good answer, darn it. And sometimes they'll question him, and then he'll ask a different question back and leave them flat-footed. So those two chapters really make Jesus, like we want that superpower, don't we? If someone's questioning us or pointedly saying stuff to us in a way that's maybe not quite fair, wouldn't we like to have that retort or that answer back? And Jesus is able to do that. It's really incredible. In the meantime, so that's kind of the vibe from the religious people. But then Jesus' vibe, his vibe is trying to correct the religious leaders, trying to point out, listen guys, what you got going on here is not right. So when Jesus comes into the temple and knocks over the table, he says, my temple is a house of prayer for all people, but you've made it into a den of thieves. So he's critiquing this habitat that should be a place of prayer and welcome and learning. It's become dysfunctional. It's become not a habitat for openness and learning. It's become a place of greed. So Jesus critiques that. Jesus also tells some stories that, seem to point to his concern, his critique of his opponents. And, one of them is, okay, Sue, the thing with the fig tree. Several places in this material, and prior to this point in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus talks about bearing fruit. Bearing fruit. So one of our texts during Lent was Matthew 7. And in that text, Jesus said, how can you tell with people? Are they good or bad, or what's going on? How can you tell the difference? And he said, you will know them by their fruit. So it's kind of like people are acting like trees. People are like trees or plants. And if they're being fruitful, and then we tied that to Galatians, fruit of the Spirit. Look at Sue's shirt today, by the way. She's wearing a fruit of the Spirit shirt today. And then the fruit of the Spirit, it talks about the fruit of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity. So those are our markers. Is this a good person or not so good? Which way should we head? How do we make decisions? How do we evaluate? It's the fruit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. So Jesus has that fruitfulness view across the Gospel of Matthew. And then here, more particularly, he's saying, these religious leaders are not bearing fruit. They're like that fig tree. And when you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, you got to call it out. Not based on how you feel or your self-centeredness, but based on standards of fruitfulness. Love, joy, peace. So Jesus is trying to point that out with the fig tree. And later he also talks about bearing fruit in these chapters. And then he tells some stories that are pretty pokey. One story he tells about, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the man asked his son, hey, would you do something for me? And the son says, no, but then goes ahead and does it. And the other son, the man said, would you do something for me? And the son says, sure, and then doesn't do it. Then Jesus asks his religious colleagues, which son did the will of God? And they said, the first one, because he just did it, even if he started off saying, no, I'm not going to do it. And then Jesus says, you know what? Okay, here's where it gets really intense. So he's in the temple talking to the religious bigwigs, and he says to them, you know what? Prostitutes and tax collectors are closer to God than you guys. Oh my gosh. So Jesus is pretty intense, and he tells another story about a banquet and how God invited people to the banquet, the usual suspects. They don't show up. So God invited other people to the banquet. He tells another story about a vineyard that God gave to people. Take care of my vineyard, guys. Take care of my vineyard. I'm going to have you special people. Take care of this thing. You are my stewards. Do a good job. And they did a terrible job of taking care of God's vineyard. And they were violent to the owner of the vineyard's son. Wink, wink. We imagine Jesus. And Jesus says, how is the owner of the vineyard going to feel when he finds out the people that were supposed to take care of it did such a terrible job and were violent? So Jesus is setting up the religious bigwigs in a way that the Old Testament prophets did. You guys, God has a certain ethical standard. You're supposed to behave a particular way, and you're squandering it. You're missing the mark. So Jesus is not inventing this stuff. He's like, here's the mark. And even you would think you above all, who are servants and serving the people, would be hitting the mark, setting the example, and helping others to get on board. And Jesus is like, no. You are systemically dysfunctional. So he does it in a particular way. Well, lately I have been reading a book. I've actually been listening to the book. I really love history a lot. And this particular book is a history of Authoritarianism. Ugh, sorry, gang. So authoritarianism. So it's looking at the history, maybe in the last 100 years or so, of authoritarian rule. People who've led their countries in an authoritarian way. And so it's analyzing those people. It's kind of a dark book. And I almost gave up on it a couple of times because it's just way too dark. Because it's like, I really don't want to read about Mussolini. You know, he was in Italy in the first part of the 20th century. Do I really want to read about Mussolini? Or a later leader in Italy, Berlusconi. And then, of course, who's in the book? Hitler is in the book. Do I really want to read about Hitler? And oh my gosh, it's such a dark book. So I almost gave up, but I thought, you know what? I got to face this book, face the facts, see what's going on. So the book tries to find patterns and what to look for, and I thought, you know, it's important to know these things, and I'm just very curious. Like, where do these people come from? And then how do they get in power? How do they stay in power? So it's just very interesting, and it's important history. So, and you know, they're everywhere. So, let's see, Gaddafi is covered, Pinochet in Chile. So it's really terrible. And it was eye-opening to me, because these are names, you know, like you hear the names, but you kind of gloss over. Okay, they're very terrible people. Those are very terrible people. Those are very terrible situations. But when you go through it piece by piece, I mean, it was really awful. The lies, the corruption, the violence toward the people. That's the part where I just wanted to throw up. All the terrible things done to people, people who protested, to women. It's just disgusting and awful. And, you know, prayers today for people in situations like that. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. Hear our prayers. So it was a very sober book, kind of dry book, very serious book. But I hung in there because I thought, I know the last part is, how do these people fall from power, right? It's like, I want to find out, how do you remove? Like, what took out Mussolini? What took out Hitler? What got rid of Pinochet or Gaddafi? Like, what's up with that? So I hung in there and saw the different movements and things that happened that took these authoritarian type of systems out. And I was very surprised by one angle of how it happened. In this very dry, historical, serious, not fluffy at all book, it said, love. Love, compassion, and normal human decency in the population is what took out the pillars of that authoritarian system. What? Love? I was kind of glad to hear that, because I thought, we talk about that at church. That's what we do here. You know, we're part of the resistance. Because the last teaching that Jesus had in the temple that day with the religious authorities who were trying to knock him out, make him look foolish, they thought, okay, well, let's give this one more go. Let's give it one more go. So a person came forward and said, okay, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus had a ready answer. The greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And by the way, Jesus said, a second commandment is like it. You are to love your neighbor as yourself. Love, love, love. Jesus continues, on those two commandments hang every other thing in the whole scriptures. Love. It is founded on love. Wow. How about that? And shortly thereafter, those opponents in the temple said, all right, we're done. We don't have any other questions for this guy. You know, it's interesting in any kind of debate how we treat our opponents. How we treat our opponents. And, some opponents, there's friendly rivalry. How's your bracket, by the way? There's good, and we get stronger with certain forms of opposition, and it's good and it's healthy and all those things. But in some forms of opponents, it's harmful and is not good. And Jesus' opponents slide from maybe healthy skepticism and debate into anger, insecurity, and violence. When they come for him in the garden, and that's one of the texts that we're going to be reading on Maundy, Thursday, I went back and I read it, and I thought, well, I'm remembering something about that story, and every gospel tells it a little bit differently, but in Matthew's gospel, when they come for Jesus in the garden, Judas betrays him with a kiss, his own follower, they come to him in Matthew with swords and clubs. And somebody with Jesus apparently has a sword too and slices off an ear. And what does Jesus say? Put away your sword. Those who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. I ask you guys, do you think if Jesus could have summoned, do you think that Jesus had the power to summon a militia? Do you think he had that power? Yeah. He had. And in fact, in Matthew, and I'd never noticed this verse before, and I didn't check to see if it's in the other Gospels, but go and see or listen on Monday, Thursday when we read this text. Jesus says to his disciples, don't you think I could have summoned a militia if I wanted to? He literally says, I could have summoned 12 legions. We've talked about a legion before. 12 legions. Jesus could have had that be his solution for help. And he said, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. So I thought there's one other thing to think about in this love thing. Love. Jesus says it's the anchor commandment. Historian says love actually works in highly dysfunctional, violent situations. I thought one other thing to think about with love is our having faith in love. I think sometimes we think, oh, love, honestly, that's lame. Or kindness, really, how fluffy. We have to have faith in love and kindness. Faith like a little seed of mustard that it's going to be okay. Just a little bit of faith. Because after Jesus preaches love, what do his opponents do? They arrest him. They have an unjust trial. They beat him up. He's tortured. And he dies. And you might think, love, that does not work. Does not work. This week when we look at the text, or this week in our own lives, we're going to experience non-love. We're going to experience non-kindness. And it's going to make us doubt that love actually works. But Holy Week and Lent, I hope, stoke our faith. Faith in love. And that's been our theme across all of Advent, our kindness habitat. It's not just small acts of kindness. It's a kindness habitat. Because we're going to have habitats and terrains where there is just ugliness and awfulness. and we're going to be tempted to not practice love. But we have faith in Jesus who practiced love the whole way through. And he forgives us when we don't quite show up in faith like all of his disciples did. But maybe we can get it right a little bit. Maybe we can grow a little bit. And that's what Lent is about. It's what Holy Week is about. It's what the Bible's about. It's people like us having a little faith in love. And that's exactly where we bear fruit. Let's see if we can bear a little bit of fruit this week. In Jesus' name, amen.